What's going on, everybody? Ginkgo Design. Excited for this one. Glad to be back in the studio. Here's where we're at, right? We have designed Ginkgo from the perspective of the traditional model of Ginkgo as a more basally dominant clump form, similar and representative of what we would experience when a tree comes in from Japan. That was a Chi-Chi Ginkgo. It's thriving in the garden right now. We talked about all of the fundamentals of handling that design conceptually, aesthetically, and technically. But here's the thing, we don't have access to that material on a regular basis, and that's where moving into more of the realm of a piece of nursery stock in the Ginkgo biloba form demands that we take a second look at design and how we go about handling this wonderful species from the single trunk form that's been cut to have a transition of taper, that's been evolved, developed, and is dealing with branching on a little bit of a different level with a little bit of a different aesthetic and a little bit of a different concept to how we go about the process and creation. Okay, so let me just give you the once around of this piece of material grown by Tom Roberts, piece of nursery stock that was then, after having been cut and sort of transitioned, put into the ground, grown. You see the base, very beautiful in its presentation, slightly unique, right? A little bit to some degree grotesque, but I think as far as a base on a Ginkgo, really, really interesting, right? A lot of character, a lot of strength, a lot of capacity to hold the size of the tree and the level of design that we're pursuing. Now this container, not the finished container, a container that was sort of an intermediate coming out of the grow bag, out of the field, and sort of transitioning, growing, and cultivating a very strong, healthy root system before we move it into its final container. And this will be an entirely different discussion of the container that serves Ginkgo as a single trunk tree aesthetically than the container that serves Ginkgo as more of a clump or basally dominant form, all right? So we see this and we start to recognize, okay, yes, this is something that I potentially have access to. We can go to a garden center, we can go to a nursery, we can see field-grown Ginkgo that are designed to be street trees, designed to be landscape trees, and you could find this similar kind of type of material. How do we go about handling it? This does become the focus of our conceptual design today. Okay, Ginkgo being pruned in the fall at leaf drop, absolutely and totally acceptable. You say, oh, that's acceptable. Why did you not prune this tree then? And we did not prune this tree because we knew that we wanted to go about the design process and the design evolution of the tree. We also did not prune this piece at that point in time because I didn't necessarily want the finer branches to be as empowered, right? And when we talk about that fall leaf drop pruning, we say, listen, we prune at the point of leaf drop so that the buds that we cut back to get that surge of sugars and starches from the fall through the winter and early spring to have the same even distribution of energy as the larger terminal tips of the tree that were left intact and were not pruned. We have an even distribution, we have an even flush of growth, we pinch or we partially defoliate and prune, come post-flush harden, and all of a sudden we start to see a tree that has a uniformity of strength in the twigging and even distribution, and refinement is on its way. Okay, with this tree, coming out of a single first styling, the first styling happened spring of last year, having evolved on that first styling, we really wanted to try and transition some of that strong energy into weaker pieces to offset some of those growth habits in a secondary form, and that is why we are leaning on spring for this period of growth. Okay, now we have a scenario here where I think the best front for this tree, and I'm just going to kind of orient the two-dimensional aspect of this base, right? If we sort of show that two-dimensional aspect here, right? Definitely not something that's pleasing. It does give us width, but if I just rotate here, and you'll notice how the base kind of improves, I take that towards the back, and all of a sudden we get a little bit more width, we get foreground, mid, and we get back, okay? But in that, we create two dimensions right here. And this is a very big part when we start to deal with this reconciliation of base and line. Base in the tree that provides visual stability, line in the tree that provides the most changes of angles, planes, directions, right? When we start to see that, we get that two dimension here, but this is a single trunk Ginkgo. This is a single trunk form. And this is where I want to take away any competing notion of two trunks or two pieces that would apply to an insinuation of apical. And here's the other part about this. This piece right here is the shorter of the two pieces, but this piece right here is the thicker of the two pieces, right? So when we reduce this to this point, we had this wonderful structure here, But one of the biggest, most catastrophic design decisions that we could make that applies to kind of the broad open application of Ginkgo design is to not shorten the thickest piece unless we plan on removing it over the course of time. Now again, this goes back to, okay, so this is the thicker of the two pieces. Why did you shorten it? I shortened it because the thinner of the two pieces had the better structure, ramification, branching presence, etc. By far and away, better movement, better branching, better structure. I don't want to remove the smaller of the two pieces just to maintain the hierarchy of the thicker piece demanding that or commanding that single trunk roll, okay? So we shorten this, okay, why did you shorten it? Why didn't you just cut it off? Because there was no shoulder that was established here. Now, Ginkgo is a prehistoric tree. Ginkgo has a very, very antiquated vascular system compared to evolutionary plant material that has developed a more sophisticated system, which means we have to err on a greater degree of caution when cutting Ginkgo back. Now, we understand on our broadleaf deciduous that we already have to have a collar present. But when we start to look at Ginkgo, we have to be insistent. We have to make sure it's obvious. We have to have complete definition on all accounts around the entirety of the cut, and that is why we shortened here. That is why we held back these pieces of growth. You'll notice this is all very, very weak compared to the growth on other parts of the tree. This was a piece that was held back, that was reduced yet again from the cut back here. This was a piece that we really focused on execution of the cultivation of the shoulder, and look at where we're at now. A very, very definitive, and you can see it actually in a few different formations of the collar, slightly different from what we typically experience. We have this central crotch here right at the shoulder. We have sort of our initial shoulder forming down here, down low. Now that's where I would ideally like to take this off, is down here low. That is a very big risky cut to make right now because as I rotate, the backside here does not have that shoulder fully established, okay? And this is where I'm saying, listen, in Ginkgo, as far as a horticultural application, if we do not have a pronounced shoulder around the entirety of the branch, we could have significant dieback and significant loss of tissue based on the under-evolved nature of this prehistoric species. Okay, but what you see is you do see the full evolved, full evolution of a collar up higher here. And so we're seeing Ginkgo try to set up the capacity to compartmentalize on multiple levels. Now here's the other thing that I see. We have nodes. We actually have raised portions. Here's a node right here. Let me show you a more pronounced node that's actually producing a bud right here, okay? So we're seeing those adventitious nodes. This is a younger tree. It has not been in a bonsai container for very long. Its strength has not really been reduced in the way that we see bonsai containers reduce and constrict. So we see these nodes, and I'm seeing nodes here. I'm seeing nodes here. I'm actually seeing locations around the collar that has formed that are telling me, hey, you can reduce, you have a vegetative node set up, and you see the formation of a multitude of collars on differing levels, and the highest of those collars is existing in a 360-degree circumference of that tissue. Excellent. This is exactly what I was trying to get to as far as a point of, and let me grab my saw. Exactly what I was trying to get to as far as a point of execution in terms of the design of Ginkgo, to understand that this is a major aspect of the cutback. Now, why does this pertain? How is this in any way applicable to what you're dealing with if we talk about Ginkgo nursery stock? Listen, if you are cutting a Ginkgo back, right, if you were going to chop a Ginkgo and start from the beginning, first and foremost, a big part of the success of this Ginkgo design is the height of the trunk. So you have a giant thick trunk or even an intermediate trunk. Do you chop that low and regrow a Ginkgo? Absolutely not. Chop it higher up. Understand that Ginkgo, when we go to the single trunk form, we have an extension of the line in the tree. And when we cut that, we don't see a collar when we cut that because it is a big tree. Maybe it has a few lower branches, right? Spring, the best time prior to the push for a tree that has a prehistoric vascular system to put all of the energy into these adventitious nodes that exist along that trunk. The biggest mistake I see in Ginkgo design from nursery stock as a single trunk form is it's chopped too low from the very beginning. You never recover from that, okay? Chop higher, extend the length of the design. This is Ginkgo on a single trunk form as an aesthetic pursuit, okay? But Once you chop that and you get that growth of all of those tangential pieces, this is the point where we now start to build the shoulder to be able to further cut back, to be able to further transition, to be able to further refine, okay? And so seeing these indicators, a very big point that we have to be aware of. I am absolutely going to leave this definitive node here. Even though I have collars formed, I still want to err on the side of caution as far as cutting this back too soon. Okay, and I'm going to go straight across, just very, very effortless. And notice how I relieve here. Just a little bit of the pressure. I'm pulling these together so that my saw does not get bound in the ginkgo. If I drop that down, it becomes a lot less smooth when we're dealing with taller trees. We don't want to put leverage on the root system. Just a little tiny technical execution that helps us get a much cleaner, smoother cut that allows us to impact the roots in a far smaller degree over the course of the work. And my cut, very, very flat and very, very flush in this. I know I'm going to come back as those shoulders become more and more defined. I want to be sure I don't cut any of the areas of the trunk or bark because ginkgo does not heal very well, right? It does not heal very well. Now, when I look at this, I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I see about 12, between 12 and 15 growth rings, depending on how you count them in this value system that you apply to ginkgo. Ginkgo has a little bit of a different vascular growth in terms of the construction of the growth rings, etc. But wow, that changes things a significant degree. Let me just go ahead and put this back really quick so that you can see this back on the tree. Okay, there's what we had, right? And it's interesting, don't get me wrong, I don't find that to be in any way offensive, but when we look at that transition now, that really starts to change the context of the tree from the formation of a singular trunk line. Okay, I want to patch this immediately, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to patch this with the putty just because it's such a big wound. Now, are there cut pastes that benefit ginkgo being such a under-evolved vascular system in terms of helping them callus and roll and stimulate a little bit more cellular production? Absolutely. The higher the hormone content in the cut paste for ginkgo, the better, because they do have a hard time compartmentalizing. They do have a hard time callusing. They do have a hard time healing wounds and rolling. And this is where we want to be very, very considerate of heavy branch reduction and do so at an early stage of development before it has been in a bonsai container for a prolonged period of time, right? One of the things that we see in bonsai when we inherit material that's been in a bonsai container for a long time is the desire to restyle, the desire to change the direction, the desire to make major moves. And one of the things that's dangerous about that, especially on the broadleaf deciduous, and when we get inside of that, in particular on a tree that has maybe a more limited capacity to compartmentalize those major changes in the structure. Satsuki azaleas would be one of these. Ginkgo would be one of these. Japanese quince, Canamelius japonica would be one of these. When we remove those heavy pieces, time in the bonsai container has decreased their strength and their vigor and their capacity to respond to a severe change in the way that the tree's vascular system and energy system works. Right? These are moves, these are things that are best executed when the tree is young, when the tree is vigorous, when the tree is super strong and has the capacity to be able to build up that tissue, heal that wound, has enough growth that's going to be taking place to continue developing the tree, that the resources are going to be moved to be able to patch and mend that damage. But when we get a super refined tree and you cut off a major branch, how is that wound going to heal if we're partially defoliating? We're pruning back 2 times a year, post partial defoliation and post-flush leaf drop in the fall. We never let the tree vigorously grow because we don't want the tips to become coarse, etc., etc. That is a really compromising situation to try and get a wound to heal in a refined tree. And now we're saying, listen, this is a tree that definitely has a little bit of a strength impediment, has a little bit of a different vascular system in the design process that we need to respect and consider. And so we start to recognize, aha, got it. Let's make those moves early on. This is why we're talking about ginkgo design and why we're focusing specifically on that single trunk form, okay? Now, once we make that change, there is the capacity in the base to allow this tree to continue to move laterally. Now, this isn't a round container, but I want to continue to emphasize, this is not the final container. I would love to have this in a glazed container. I would love to have this in a beautiful oval glazed container specifically. If you want to talk about the kind of container color that I would want to pursue for this, for whatever reason, you know, when I think about Ginkgo, I do move kind of to either thinking about complementing the yellow coloration of the fall, right? Or complementing the green coloration that occurs over the course of the growing period. And naturally, if I'm starting to think about those two things, you know, my color orientation is going to reference the color wheel. So I could see orange being nice both for the bark, right? As well as for the fall color. It could be kind of rock and roll. I think that a blue moving into indigo could be pretty rock and roll. I think that could be nice. Because here's the thing, you get that golden color, but you also have this cream colored trunk. Right? Now where it's interesting here is you almost have an analogous touch point in terms of the yellow coloration of the horse Hansel-Rider, but then you have this red that forms this odd dynamic. But I would really love to see this in a glazed oval container. I think that that would be the strongest kind of visual insinuation, okay? Here's why I'm talking about containers, because the round formation would suggest that we plan on this tree continuing to lean to the left. But Ginkgo as a species, as a tree that exists, you would be hard pressed outside of finding a Ginkgo that's on its way down. And when we touch on ancient as an aesthetic, greater degree of asymmetry, remnants of what was, and a larger amount of negative space, all of these things, you would be executing a Ginkgo that was dying with you know, and when you say, listen, a bristlecone pine 5,000 years old is kind of dying, it's on its way out, but we're still talking, we have several thousand years. If you saw a Ginkgo executing a highly asymmetrical shape, you're saying, listen, this tree probably doesn't have more than 10 years to live. Ginkgo as a tree is an upright form. I mean, it is upright, it is flame-shaped. We know that from the last Ginkgo design in terms of the basally dominant piece. We have that same consideration with this tree, which is to say, okay, that means that this whole trunk needs to come back, right? We need to be moving in that direction, and defining the line base to tip as the initiation of design in any tree, right? We set structure first, define the line base to tip, create the defining branch, and everything else follows as the reference point. Round container would suggest I'm moving out. I see people handle Ginkgo in all of these contorted, weird ways. That's not how they grow. It's not what's flattering to the aesthetic of the tree. And when we start to look at Ginkgo, this is one of the only trees where I'm going to say, hey, listen, like a formal upright, moving the apex back closer to the base on a single trunk form of Ginkgo is going to create a more flattering aesthetic and allow that Ginkgo to exist in your garden as a complement to the rest of your bonsai collection. Okay? I've never been in a garden where there's 50 Ginkgo trees as bonsai subjects. I haven't. Now, that's not to say it doesn't exist, but I've never seen that. Right? Ginkgo is an accent. As a species, you see one, you see two, maximum you see three in a garden. At this point in time at Mirai, we've got three really, really nice Ginkgo. We've got a small clump, we've got a big clump, and we have this single trunk form, okay? I doubt that Mirai is ever gonna have more than 3 Ginkgo here, because it is a unique aesthetic. So to say, hey, listen, I'm gonna move this back towards up over the center of the base, and now all of a sudden we're kind of moving against the grain of suggesting age and drama and all of these things. Yes, but this is a nice counterpoint aesthetically as a species of uniqueness and diversity of form, leaf shape, color, texture, etc. And in terms of styling and design, workability, a different nuance here. This is a counter to what is, you know, accepted now in the modern bonsai world as a standard of this creation of age. I'm going to move that base, that apex, back over the base as the beginning of definition of line base to tip, okay? Focusing heavily, first design of any broadleaf deciduous tree, getting that dramatic movement into all parts and pieces. Okay, we typically use the paper wrap copper historically at Mirai. It allows us to have dramatic change. It allows us to accomplish things with a higher level of aesthetics. Now in this second styling, I am moving to aluminum, entirely aluminum, and preferably with Ginkgo. Very thin, very soft bark, right? Much like a Japanese maple, if we scar this thing, we are gonna see this for the rest of this tree's life, okay? It's really tough with ginkgo's slow growth rate to recover from damaging the bark of the tree, okay? So the notion of paper wrap copper necessary to be able to have the kind of implications and create the kind of change and movement that we're looking for in initial design. When we get to this second move, moving to aluminum and making aluminum the reference, definitely something that we want to be aware of. Okay, now let's plan technically the execution of this wiring process, because I know from the front here, I want the apex to move that way. And when we think about the technical aspect of that, we know the apex is going to want to return to where it came from. It's going to want to come back this way. I want it to move that way. It wants to come back this way. Where does my structural wire? I don't have another thick piece to anchor a 6 or 7 millimeter aluminum wire to. I don't want to wire it to this. I don't want to wire it to this. I'm certainly not going to stick it in the ground and wire it up the trunk. I only want to move this part. It wants to move back this way. Guess what? I have to start my wire on this side. If I'm going to do a detached piece of structural wire, I have to think about wiring dynamics, okay? If that's the case, and I'm going to come up onto this, and I need this to exist on this side, I've got a 7 mil wire. That means that my turns of my 7 mil wire is going to be very, very long, which is to suggest that if I'm going to be holding here, I'm going to be coming up with a nice elongated turn. This little crotch right here, this is a magic little spot, okay? Because that allows me to get through all of the conundrums of that junction where the original chop took place, okay? Going nice and long in terms of my spacing, thinking very, very hard about same angle, same spacing, no gaps. And watch what I do here. I'm just going to go ahead and I'm just going to finish that right there as that point where the function of my wire is going to be achieved, okay? Now, as I'm going up, I'm going to have to make sure, because I don't have an anchor, I'm going to have to make sure that my wire does not rotate and scuff this thin bark. This is a very strong sort of technical moment of wire application when we go with a singular piece, okay? I love having a shoulder here of another branch, not as an anchor point, but just as a point of contact that gives me some sense of stability, raised and separate from the singular trunk that exists here. That's a major piece that I can play on, not necessary. Again, I'm not wiring to this, but it gives me something that allows me to sort of stabilize this application of wire, okay? Now, any of these junctions or nodes, I want to avoid those as much as I can. I want to keep these pieces intact, but you're going to see that when you put this kind of thought and consideration into the beginning of wiring as an execution, that things kind of serendipitously start to work out as you work your way up the tree. Okay, now we recognize that we want to be trying to achieve same angle, same spacing, but as we move up the tree, we are going to have, with the decreasing thickness of the trunk, we are going to have a little bit of the change of spacing and the change of angle as the trunk gets thinner and thinner over that sort of climb up the trunk. Now, as we get to the top, this is what we were trying to avoid down below. Notice this piece right here, okay? This is a cut. This cut is deteriorating. It does have a shoulder forming right here, but this is a very minor cut that occurs on a ginkgo in a very thin form. And this may have been something that we did last time. It's tough to say, but let me go ahead and just cut this back and see if we can kind of highlight that shoulder that's forming and get down to living tissue. Let's see if we can get down to living tissue. This will be really interesting because this will be a significant discussion of ginkgo's capacity to compartmentalize. And it looks like we did not get to living tissue. Okay, let me show you what we got. No, we did. We did. Nice. Nice. We got compartmentalization. That's great. Okay, notice that we have the blonde kind of growth rings all the way around right here. Means we maintained water flow. I thought this had potentially died back a little bit more. We've got our color formed. I love that. That's excellent. That's really, really wonderful to see. Not a definitive color, but when I come back to this piece, I do see a nice little piece of color right there that's forming. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to clean up the rest of this. I've got these little buds that are occurring. I've got a nice little branch here that I would love to facilitate. I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to cleanly remove the remainder of the response to that reduction right there, okay? And then I want to take my knife and I want to cleanly create that transition, okay? Cleanly create that transition right here. So I'm going to come back to my box cutter, which I use to refine all cuts. And when we start to talk about a challenge in compartmentalization, you might be saying, well, you didn't do this on the saw cut. I didn't do this on the saw cut because that's not the finished sort of cut point, right? So I'm not necessarily as concerned on the saw cut piece. I'm not as concerned with the edge of that being kind of primed to heal. But this, I would love for this to be the last time that we touch this piece right here. Okay, so I'm just going to clean up those edges. I'm going to come back and I'm going to paste that with the same cut putty to have the transition finalized. And then I can start to really work on this little small twig here that can grow and start to move in a direction that gives me 1, 2, right? My leader plus a branch at that junction. Avoid any inverse swelling. There is a little bit, and you will see this over the course of time when we're starting to work nursery stock where multiple pieces have occurred. You will start to see some of these areas swell. The earlier we catch it, the better our tree will be, okay? So we have all of those pieces in play now. We've made that adjustment. I don't need to take this any higher because I don't have a necessity for it. And I've got a beautiful transition here, right? These two pieces are going to work very closely together. This piece feels like it's probably going to work with one of these lower pieces, or maybe these lower pieces work together depending on what we want to do. But let's go ahead and see if we can get this upper piece moved and have some sort of adjustment to the apical region. Okay, now I'm going to have to support down here. I want to be very, very clear that I've got a support down here, and I want to be working in terms of, and you can see that kind of kicking out right here, but I'm trying to get movement. I'm trying to get that apex back in that direction, okay? So when we start to look at that, just a little bit of an adjustment, a little bit of a shift is all that we're looking for to have that apex headed back. Nice, 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 okay? Getting that primary line headed back towards the center of that base, okay? And it just kind of took it from here, brought it to here, and then the apex is going to come here, right? I am absolutely okay with that. I'm absolutely okay with that, okay? Before we move on, though, let's make sure that the apical region is defined, and let's work through this kind of final point from here to here, okay? Now, I'm going to stay in some pretty heavy gauges when I'm dealing with ginkgo. Ginkgo tends to be a fairly coarse tissue tree, which is to say it's rather rigid, it's rather stiff. So if I'm using 7mm heavy aluminum to bend the trunk, and I have pieces that are, still 70% of that diameter, I want to stay in the realm of heavier wire in this second working, because we know from this point forward, especially in the apex, that we want to be focused significantly on building ramification and kind of continuing to accentuate the leaf mass that occurs in this upper apical region. And ginkgo as a species, when we start to talk about ginkgo design, demands that we leave a lot of strength in the apical region, okay? Because if we take the strength out of the apical region of ginkgo, it's tough to get it back. And what you see with a lot of ginkgo bonsai over the course of time, especially when we talk about the chichi ginkgo and the chichi ginkgo clump style forms, right, is you see the apex collapse over the course of time. This is a major, major risk. Now, the apex collapse in ginkgo is almost directly associated with that upper apical region not being empowered, right? The branches being cut back to facilitate supporting pieces on other parts of the lower portion of the tree, of the basal occurrences being allowed to over-proliferate and take the strength or suck the strength out of that upper portion of the tree, as well as a mishandling in the sheen of the tree, right? When we start to see ginkgo lose power in the apex, and for most of our broadleaf deciduous that are lower water mobility, okay, ginkgo will lower water mobility. Again, we have this kind of prehistoric behavior to the vascular tissue. That lower water mobility suggests, hey, we have a sensitivity, a necessity in the sheen, definite necessity in the sheen of ginkgo. And that sensitivity with that necessity in the sheen right, means that if we let the sheen become unhealthy, and here's our move back, okay, there's our front, there's our move back, I'm quite happy just to have that headed. Maybe I go a little bit more. I don't need a ton. I don't need a ton. Okay, but maybe we go just a little bit more back to bring that as close to the base as we possibly can. Here's our base. Getting pretty close, okay? Well, when we talk about that sheen, necessary to keep the apical region of our broadleaf deciduous strong, alive, and healthy. Okay, I'm going to transition right here. Big, huge, coarse tip. Boom. Transition. Watch what happens here. Okay, I applied my wire all the way up to the top here. Notice this big, thick piece. Look at this ramified growth that I have down here. This is exactly what we're talking about. I need that ramified growth. I want that ramified growth. I want the transition of that ramified growth, okay? I'm going to take off that structural piece there, and I'm going to come back straight across, right? I don't want to make a diagonal cut, straight across, boom, okay? Nice transition to a beautiful secondary that now takes over as the leader. And now we start to see these big, thick, coarse pieces from the original creation. Notice this is still big and beefy. We don't have any secondary tertiaries here. This contributed to the original design. This would be the moment where we directionally prune back to start to cultivate these same kind of secondary tertiary pieces that offer a lot more fineness and finesse in the shape of ginkgo. You see here as well. Notice that we have this big beefy coarse piece. Probably one of the moves at this point in time is going to be to take out this big thick coarse piece. Let's go ahead and let's reduce that. Bam. Okay? Taking that off, transitioned of taper base to tip. We see some of these stubs, right? Stub. Notice this. I have a dead stub right here. I've got a directional bud right here. Let's go ahead and let's take that off. Really nice and clean. Okay? Let's see how we're doing. Oh, I like that a lot. And I actually like the subtlety of the movement. You have to embrace ginkgo design from the perspective that this is not a tree that is going to have, we're not going for radical. Again, I don't want this kind of movement, right? I want this kind of movement. Like that, right? Like that. That's all I want, okay? Really, really subtle, okay? So we've moved that apex. Let me see if I can get a little bit more, okay? And then I'm going to go ahead, watch this. This is my holding point. And we're done, okay? And we're done. Now here's the thing. I don't get to move that apex anymore. I just decided on it, I positioned it, I cut it, that's it. We're done. Forever hold your peace, okay? Forever hold your peace. And now we get to start working from the bottom up because we effectively have defined that line base to tip. We're starting to reduce some of these bigger pieces to more refined areas, but let's set the tone from the bottom up. And we recognize, listen, ginkgo is this type of a tree, okay? Boom. Really acute, up and out, but here's the last move, back in, right? Up and out, back in. Because we're talking about the flame shape. The flame shape. Okay? And that comes from the way that the branching is organized as well as the length that it is pruned to. And we say, hey, listen, the lowest branches on ginkgo are not necessarily the thickest. In fact, what you're seeing here is very true to form for ginkgo design. Okay, these are pieces that are adventitiously occurring after the fact, right? These are occurring after the fact. These are coming onto the tree after it's become a big tree. The lower branches being more slender than the upper branches. Absolutely accurate in every way, shape, and form. So let's embrace that and let's start with these bottom pieces. Now you might be saying, okay, but you said, what about your defining branch? You know, how does that work? I would say that the defining branch on the tree is probably right here. I would say that that's probably our defining branch. And having a slight degree of asymmetry off to the left, I'm okay with that, but I would rather the apex be closer to the center of the base and have that slight asymmetrical push coming to the left. That feels good to me. Everything sounds like it's working. Let's go ahead and let's start building from the bottom up. So these pieces, naturally, I'm automatically looking at this and I'm saying, boom, I'm coming in, and then these pieces are coming out. Okay, coming in, pieces are coming out. I want to be careful about how these lines overlap. I want to be careful about how this engages with this. But first and foremost, let's start from the bottom. This is where we start and are capable of, right? Where we start and where we're empowered to begin to build from the bottom up. Okay, now I'm going to be moving. This is 4.5. we take the tags off of these so that we can more easily use them, and then we end up re-tagging them because we don't know what the heck we're talking about when it comes to millimeter gauges, right? The way that North American copper, I was just in Italy dealing with millimeters on copper and aluminum, which is so counter because, 6 millimeter copper is 4 gauge copper, but then as you go down in millimeters, you go up in gauges. 18 gauge copper is like 1 millimeter is 1 millimeter aluminum. It's super, super confusing when you try to equate those two systems. Thankfully, I had that background in Japan of the system. But even in Japan, if you talk about gauges, gauge versus millimeters, totally, totally different. Because gauges of copper in Japan are two gauge separation from North America. So that is to say, 4 gauge in North America is 6 gauge copper in Japan. But then in Europe, they say 4 gauge. They don't even use gauge. They just use millimeters. And they say, hey, listen, I need a 6 millimeters would be the equivalent of a 4 gauge, right? And a 4 gauge would be the equivalent of a 6 gauge in Japan. So you have these like, it's like currency. You have these currency systems to the way that these different currencies in the bonsai wire form are handled, okay? Nice little up and out. I'm not going to carry this wire too far. And one thing that we do need to recognize about Ginkgo from its perspective of the buds, not only the positioning of the buds, but also the attachment point of the buds. The attachment point of the buds is very, very small and very, very weak, okay? So as I'm working on this structural wire, I just want to be considerate and aware of the fact that I need to be constantly careful and protective of the quality of the buds. Now, when we get to this next piece, notice that we have this branching transition here. I've got this kind of big, straight, chunky, coarse piece. I do have buds set up on it. I probably don't want to cut that piece off, except for, notice that this is a very straight, rigid shoulder right here, okay? Now, if I cut this piece off, notice that there's no collar on this side of the branch whatsoever, right? This is a really significant moment in Ginkgo design when we see this, okay? And I'm going to keep rotating because you'll see the almost, 45-degree angle that this is kind of originating. This was a bud, obviously a directional push out of growth, probably stimulated by the prune here. If I come back in and I cut this here, I'm never going to get another bud on this side of the branch. The next possible location is already determined right here, and I'm never going to get something any tighter in here either, okay? So we're thinking in terms of Ginkgo design about these choices that we make and the tightness of the internodes and the capacity to heal and the potential for the dieback over the course of time. This is a moment where if I cut this branch back, as we typically would to get more movement, and to get a transition, that this branch over the course of time will probably suffer dieback. 2, 3, 4 years from now, we'll see this branch become weaker and weaker and weaker. We have a longer and longer internode because it never gets any tighter than this right here, and we will have made a fatal error today that we will see 3 or 4 years later, right? So a Ginkgo in development has these kinds of decision-making processes. I'm going to cut this thicker, coarse tip back to a nice tight internode, directionally pruned. Here's my bud at the top, here's this piece here. Leaving that intact and using wire to close the gap of that, that is the move. That's the move with Ginkgo. And that's an adjustment to the standard way in which we would historically and typically handle ramification on our broadleaf deciduous trees, right? That not many species demand that kind of thought and consideration in the reduction of that growth. Okay, now let me contrast that. Let's look at this one right here. Okay, because when we start to look at this piece right here, we've got this big elongated section. We pruned back this chunky piece. We've got this secondary here. Okay, but here's what we got at the collar that's so advantageous. We got a bud on this side. We got a bud on this side. We've got buds capable of moving in 2 directions. Now I recognize I don't want a bud growing back towards the trunk. I would rather a bud growing out into this region away from the trunk. I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to selectively prune or remove the bud on this side, okay? And then I'm going to come back right here and I'm going to flushly cut that stump off right at that junction, okay? Right at that junction, because I have a bud that's continuing to move water up and around and through that region of the tree. Okay, I've got a big long internode here. This is another circumstance. I've got a nice short tight compact internode here, but at that, 2 pieces, main branch plus a small secondary. Boom, boom, I've got these pieces. Do I cut this elongated piece off? No, I don't. Same scenario as we had over there. We're gonna go ahead, close that gap, elevate this into that space, and continue cultivating what we've already begun to build from this perspective and portion of the tree, okay? So these are the moments in Ginkgo design where we have the capacity, we're traveling down the highway and we veer off course, right? Because we start treating them like they are a typical standard broadleaf deciduous tree. That's not how Ginkgo works. And it comes down to these decisions in the developmental process that paved the way for the future of this tree and the behavior, potential positive direction, or potential negative direction that we're moving, okay? Now I have another little stub that I'm noticing right here, and I have just this beefed up collar. Let me show you the collar right here, definitively established. A little bit of a challenging scenario here because we create this sort of big loop, but notice that we have this piece right in the middle of that. That is really, really significant, okay? You see that stump right there? You see this piece behind it. When I do this, it looks like they're the same piece. It's not. That beefed up collar, that is all that I need to see to know I can cut right across that. I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna remove that piece from this. I'm gonna cleanly define that collar with the razor blade. We're gonna patch it and start to move forward. Now I'm gonna have to change. Ginkgo design is all about in towards the main and out at an acute angle. I'm gonna have to change the angle or at least the nature of this crotch. Now a lot of us would be encouraged or potentially tempted to remove that branch to take away this U-shaped crotch. If you remove that branch, you are in a world of hurt. And I'm just being careful to protect the shoulder. I'm being careful to protect the branch behind it. Being careful to not pop through this cut and damage the bark of that branch. Okay? Yeah, nice and clean. Okay? But look at that on the grander scale. That is not unattractive. Okay? A little bit, we see it a little bit, in terms of this shape, right? So when we start to think about that, the more that I can close that, the better that that's going to be. Let me go ahead and clean that up and paste it. Okay, and when you're dealing with nursery stock, when you're dealing with Ginkgo from this perspective of a tree that has a lot of general cuts, a lot of us can do the initial styling and have these general scenarios that we're dealing with. How do you come back and continue to evolve them? That's why we didn't do the first styling on the stream. Okay, we talked about sort of handling of the material from the clump style form. We created this. These are the moments. Okay, the first time you cut it when the tree is super vigorous as a piece of nursery stock, you can get away with murder. You can get away with absolute murder. But when we talk about Ginkgo and design over the course of time, these moments where we can go in the positive direction or we can veer off the highway, these are the pieces that we need to talk about to empower you to have success and continue to make the decisions as you respond to the tree's reaction to your initial design to have the best possible outcome over the course of time. And how hard is it? How hard is bonsai to have these kinds of intricacies necessary to be able to maximize material that, if we make the wrong decision, has a significant repercussion that we can never fix again? This is why there aren't 50 Ginkgo in somebody's collection. Again, I just want to keep going back to that. There isn't enough practice with Ginkgo for this information to be readily understood and acknowledged and known, okay? There isn't enough handling of Ginkgo for this to be common knowledge, right? It's not a pine, it's not a juniper, it's not a maple, right? It's not a beech, it's not a hornbeam. It's an outlier. In many ways, handling Ginkgo would be like handling a rose bush or a sagebrush in North America or Europe, because you're like, I don't know. And in Japan, there's probably only a handful of people that really know how to handle Ginkgo well. right? Because it is so incredibly unique as a standalone species, okay? All right, that's picked up. I'm going to go ahead. Now, as I move forward with my wiring concepts, I'm going to go here to here. Let me just walk you through the back of this. I've got a very tight junction here. I'm okay with this at the moment. Ginkgo is not going to thicken at a rate that's going to cause inverse swelling here, but I do need to be aware that at some point a decision is going to have to be made. So I'm going to go here and here, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take this piece around, and I'm going to jump onto the shoulder of this piece. Let me do that big one first and then merge those two second, so that I'm set up structurally to have all of the bigger branches on the lower portion of the tree. Okay, so the big structural pieces have been wired and positioned, and you are starting, and this is exactly, when we start to talk structure, Ginkgo is all about structure. Because if the structure is not correct, then establishing that flame shape afterwards is almost impossible. And I think, again, this is another one of those moments where we really have to kind of step back and recognize that the baseline establishment, that first initial styling has cutbacks, has branch angles changed because the lower branches on a nursery stock are going to be low and we need to bring them up and then out again, right? It's going to have a reduction of the height. It's going to have establishment of the lines. But this second time, this is when we get into the nuanced applications. We understand about the collar. We understand about cutting back and where those pitfalls exist potentially that will impact us over the course of time. If we're not starting to see this kind of quality come from our tree at this point in time in the styling and design, then it means that we have made a misstep in our actions up to this point. We should really start to see this. Now, here's why I wanted to come back at this point in time instead of continuing to wire, because I'm making decisions on these big pieces right here. And this one specifically is very, very confusing to me because I don't want to let this continue to elongate at these big, long pieces out here if I'm not going to have it be this big and this thick over the course of time. Now we talked about this potentially being our defining branch. I still feel that this is going to be the defining branch, even though these pieces are going to be coming up and we are going to be moving back into that flame-shaped form. Okay, so we still have a continuation of that nuance here, right? But how do I handle this? And let me show you one more. How do I handle this piece in the back? Do I cut them back now to get ramification that's going to contribute to that flame shape? If I don't, I think it's going to be very hard in the future to transition the strength from the tip to these interior pieces over the course of time. Another nuance of Ginkgo structure that exists and we need to acknowledge. So I'm looking at this and I'm seeing the size and the thickness of this. Notice that these two pieces being opposing of each other, there not being another branch on the right side, this is a very important structural piece. Currently they are at the same height. Currently they are basically at that same height, at that same length. And let me just go ahead and push 2D for you and you can see that they're literally the same thing. Okay, they're literally the same piece. So do I drop down here, take advantage of this finer piece? That would be my sort of Ginkgo-based decision to empower the interior pieces to become branches and start to build these finer pieces coming off of such a large, thick, established piece. Now in the original design, and you might be saying, well, why did you leave it at all? Because in the original design, we didn't know. We were just fitting it into where are the pieces, what are the lengths, let's create the backbone of this. Now that we're at this point, it did not ramify off of that initial cut. I see very strong pieces that are established as a result of that initial sort of styling. I have some nice tight internodes. Boom, boom, boom. And then I get up here, bing, bing. Those are the two right there where I start to look at this and I start to say directional output here and here, okay? And I have a nice tight internode through this section, and then it starts to really elongate. Excellent, excellent. Let's go ahead and let's make that cut. Let's reduce that piece right there, okay? Now when we make those cuts, let's go ahead and paste those cuts. Talking about moving back to the liquid, and I will go through and I will paste every cut on this tree. At the end of the work, just a nice little gooey drop of goodness there. And I'm even gonna paste smaller cuts on Ginkgo. Okay, I'm gonna paste these small open cuts that I'm creating where I'm taking off dead stubs, etc., because Ginkgo does have a hard time compartmentalizing, okay? But that reduction right here, I feel like this is one of those moments where we have to be making a cut that isn't advantageous for the current shape of the tree, but will benefit the tree significantly in the future based on the fact that we are recognizing, hey, this is the move that allows this piece to have the very best possible potential. Okay, let's move to the one in the back, because I feel like the one in the back is equally as complex in terms of our desire to have a more complete tree immediately, but also not really having the kind of quality or caliber of branching that we're looking for, okay? So we start to look at the buds, bud, 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 big internode, okay? Stop it right here, and let me show you, let me just give you that, okay? So I got bud, 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 okay? Let me go, bud, 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 big internode, come on. Bam, okay? Take that back. Let's push into that tight, nice, highly ramifiable piece. Right now, with all the stored energy, the reestablished root system, we should see this piece proliferate with branching as a result of that cut this spring. But the bigger notion of that for Ginkgo is don't build ramification on those elongated internodes in a containerized environment. As the strength starts to constrict, the tree starts to be sort of held in terms of its growth rate. Use this moment, use these early stages to cut back to the pieces that are going to give you the tightest branching and the tightest ramification, okay? Now, from this point forward, the scope of work moves into secondary, tertiary. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to wire out the secondary, tertiary. We've discussed a tremendous amount in terms of the structural moves and the pruning moves that allow us to have success at this moment in time. Okay? The secondary, tertiary work that we're going to be performing is going to conform to that flame shape and is going to be reduced to enhance the ramification, right? If we become in love with the shape of Ginkgo, okay, and let me just give you the once around so that you see the tree in its entirety, okay, and that back branch right there, I'm already acknowledging this back branch right here, we need to come more up towards the main and then back out. The movement on that piece is standing out as kind of a little bit of an eyesore. Notice that. It's just like this very rigid, straight piece in the entire shape and the design. Let's see if we can fix that real quick. Okay, so we're going to come up, up. Now, if we have to, we'll even hold this with a guy wire right here so that we can come out and have that be a much more beautiful addition filled with movement. I like that a lot better. Let's go ahead and get that. Let's go ahead and get that set. That's a big, big structural improvement if we can make that work. Okay, and I'm going to use a little bit of an oversized piece of rubber. Use an oversized piece of rubber because I don't want any scarring on this. And I say oversized in terms of a slightly thicker, even though this is not a big, huge move, slightly thicker piece of rubber gives me the ability to ensure that I don't damage the bark of Ginkgo. Okay, and I'm even going to use just a real subtle, darker 16 gauge copper, darker so that it fits in with the aluminum. And then I'm happy to use just a slightly smaller piece here. And I want to be careful around these buds. Take a bud off, you don't get it back on a Ginkgo. let's see how that does in terms of, and I'm just gonna leave that tail on just for a minute. Oh, now that's way better. Notice how that fits in with the angle of everything so much more. And let's just take a look at it from the front here. Yeah, that's way, 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 way better. Okay, our front kind of somewhere in here now. And I like the way that that plays out here. Go ahead and push that out. Okay, that feels really good to me. A lot of force on that piece of rubber right there. Okay, but we'll go ahead and we'll accept that. That feels really, really nice. Okay, so as we were saying, okay, now with the secondary tertiaries, we're going to be wiring these. These have to play into that flame shape. They have to exist inside of this nuance. So that means we're going to be closing gaps. We're going to be pushing into the interior. We're going to carry these pieces out. Now, when we say, listen, ginkgo here and then coming back, the branches don't come back. The step down of our ramification has to come back, okay? So I'm going to wire out some of the secondary tertiaries. I'm going to put that movement in, but we're going to come back and we're going to prune them together to input that flame shape into the tree and really pull on that ultimate design, directional pruning, and handling of secondary tertiary from the perspective of alteration of the length to achieve the flame shape. Let me go ahead and focus on secondary tertiary and we'll come back when it's time to prune. Woo! Ginkgo wired. Okay, now here we are, and notice how drawn out this piece has become. This was the focus, and this was in the beginning. We said, listen, the line of that tree, you have to understand the line of that tree is going to be extended when we handle ginkgo nursery stock to create that singular trunk form. Here is what makes this look like a big tree. This is a big tree form. When we bring those branches up and then back out, all of a sudden, that starts to make this tree go, whoa, right? Big ginkgo. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen a big ginkgo in the native environment, but they are huge. And a lot of people say, well, ginkgo don't grow like that. I've got ginkgo in my street, and that's not how they look. Okay, no, I understand. In the youthful stages of ginkgo, that's like comparing it to a bald cypress and saying, well, a bald cypress grows like a perfect Christmas tree. True, when it's 25 years old, right? Ginkgo grows like a round ball. True when a ginkgo is 25 to 50 to 80 years old. But let's talk about a 200-year-old ginkgo, right? If we're going to tap into age, not on the decline, not ready to fall apart. Let's talk about that 200-year-old ginkgo. Let's talk about that 120, 150, 200, 300, 400, 500, 800,000, 2,000-year-old bald cypress, right? Where we start to see that flattening out of that form and shape. These are the moments where we start to base our notions and understandings of the aesthetic on, and that's really what we're focused on here, okay? So coming back to these smaller secondary, tertiary pieces, I want to be very, very accurate and considered. Directional pruning to be sure, tighter internodes, and even on some of these lower pieces, I'm going to start from the ground up, right? But I have this, and let's just see, okay? I have this move. I come up, and then I need to be coming back in. Now notice what's happening with these longer branches here, okay? Maybe we even start here. Let's go ahead and start here. Let's just do it just for the sake of doing it, okay? I got node, 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 big node. Boom, I'm gonna cut right here, okay? I got on this one, node, 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 big node. Boom, I'm gonna cut right here. Oh, let me go ahead and get a nice clean cut. Sorry about that, okay? Very, very fibrous right there. Okay, I've got node, 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 big, 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 big node. Okay, I want to take that off. Okay, I've got node, 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 node. Oh, big node, take that off. Node, 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 big node. Big, big, elongated node. Okay, this is one of those moments though. This is one of those moments. I can't cut that piece off, right? If I cut that piece off, I'm in big, big trouble. Okay, but look at what's happening now. This move back in towards, okay? Now we're starting to get this move back in towards. So let's go ahead and let's finish it. Boom. 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 Okay, top of the flame. Top of the flame. Right there. Okay, now here we are here. See these pieces outside? Okay, we've got node, node, node. I'm going to directionally prune. I want to keep heading out. Okay, now I'm heading out. Node, 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 node. A little bit of a big node here. Let me just make sure I feel, yeah. I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to take this back. I went one too far. Let me go ahead and take this back here. And I still want that control there. And I'm going to directionally prune headed that way, okay? I like that. I like that. That feels good to me, okay? So we start to see the top tapering back in, right? Yes, I love this, okay? Defining branches hanging out here, just rocking and rolling, right? Really worked hard to try as much as we can and sort of set that structure so that we engage three-dimensionally. Now let's carry this through the bottom. Okay, so we said, these bottom pieces need to stay small. They need to stay short. They need to stay small. Okay, I got node, 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 big node, big node. I gotta come back farther. I went way too far on this one. Okay, so I'm going to come back all the way to here. Oof, nice. Okay, I got node, node, node. I'm going to come back big node, nice and short. Big node, nice and short. Big node, nice and short. And all of a sudden, let's take a look at that again from the main cam. And now you start to see those lower pieces nice and small. Now, if we have any overlapping lines, like right here, similar to the bald cypress design, we just want to open those lines up just a little bit, okay? So you start to see we come out, and then we go back in. That's the move with Ginkgo. Okay, let me go ahead and continue. Got node, 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 node. I really went too far with this one. Boom, boom, boom. Okay, and I want to always cut my wire before I come back. Always cut your wire. Don't cut the wire and the branch at the same time. It is going to create a very, very sloppy cut. Okay, so I'm going to come all the way back into there. Okay, and then I've got node, node, node. Now this one is questionable. That one is questionable out there because if I pull that one in, then we lose the width here before we come back in here. That width, the wide point right there, that's one of the cruxes of design of Ginkgo. I have to leave that one. That's where I pull back on that concept of continuing to reduce, 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 reduce. That piece on that wide point is really what we need to be looking at. Okay, so interestingly enough, from the original structure that we pruned when we styled this piece the first time, the secondary, tertiary nodes that have occurred, those first few with each push of growth in the spring, are going to be nice and tight as the tree just starts to move. And as it really starts to ramp up its sugar starch productivity, we see those nodes elongate. If we prune to the correct location in those initial designs, we come back and we shorten to those tighter nodes, and all of a sudden that dictates the length. But here we see an exception, right? Here we see an exception where that wide point in the middle of the tree is what creates that shape right there. And again, it's not the branches coming back in. The branches are coming out. It's the step down of the branches to establish that hierarchy that gives us that shape in the design of Ginkgo. Let me give you a once around. This is a really, it came out better than I anticipated as we work through the design of Ginkgo. There's always, some nuance that you discover because, again, we don't handle this tree very, very often in terms of its species nuances, okay? But there's always something to discover in terms of the aesthetic of the piece. And there's you can see there's kind of a little bit of a flatness there that we can kind of work on dimensionally right there. Sort of all of the branches that are existing in that plane where it expands, but not too shabby for a piece on nursery stock. Second styling and design? Are you kidding me? You Gotta love that. I think that's our front right there. That's got to be the new front. A little bit off of where we previously had been looking at this tree, but I think as far as, base gets us there, but I think you got to see that space right in here. Now, I wonder if this space could be improved too. We pulled the other one in. What happens if we pull this in and kick that out? What does that look like? I like that width though. I like that defining branch as the width. I want to see this piece in the back. I want to see this space right there. I'm looking just past the camera into the screen beyond us. Yeah, getting that piece right there. Okay? Really interesting exploration. Really, really fun species to be working with. But those nuances of ginkgo design, those are the pieces that we've got to be focusing on. The pruning locations, the structural setting, the handling of the tertiary to create the flame-shaped model. You have a lot of tools in your tool belt to be able to come back, work with ginkgo, take a piece of accessible nursery stock, move it through the process over the course of time to make the right cuts, understand the repercussions of those cuts, and build a beautiful design. Good luck. Enjoy Ginkgo biloba. Strong tree in its youth, capable of becoming a great bonsai, handling the nuances correctly and mastering the species, something that's well within all of our wheelhouse. You have the knowledge to do it. Good luck. Enjoy. Love you guys. Mwah!